Imagine this, a quiet village deep in the Welsh hills. Nothing stirs at 2 a.m. Nothing except the sky itself. February 26, 2016. Residents of Pentrych report a strange glow. At first they think it's a flare, but it doesn't fade. Red, bright, motionless, hovering, then it splits. 3 points of light, forming a perfect triangle suspended over the valley. People freeze in disbelief. Dogs bark, sheep scatter. The air vibrates. Something is up there. And it isn't human. Moments later, a low hum grows into a roar. Helicopters, jets, military aircraft sweep in from all directions. Searchlights cut through the mist. They are looking for it, then the unthinkable. A smaller light darts from the formation, disappearing in seconds. Seconds later, the ground shakes. A concussive blast rattles windows. Trees are splintered, grass scorched. Something landed or fell. By dawn, blacked-out trucks and soldiers move through the fields. Barriers are set. Witnesses are told to leave. The Ministry of Defense calls it Exercise Chameleon, routine training. Nothing to see, but the fields tell a different story. Burned patches of earth, broken branches, elevated electromagnetic readings. Objects recovered before anyone could ask questions. Years later, Pentych remembers, not just the lights, but the silence that followed. The official reports, the redacted files, the stories that were never fully told. What hovered over Pentrych that night? And why even now do the authorities refuse to answer? Because some mysteries are never meant to be explained. February 24, 2016. The wind rolled quietly through the Vale of Glamorgan, carrying the faint hum of distant engines over the Welsh hills. From the outskirts of Pentrych, a small farming village west of Cardiff, the night sky looked ordinary. Stars faint, clouds low, the kind of damp quiet only the countryside knows. Yet for several nights running, residents had begun to notice something wrong with the silence. Aircraft, low-flying, persistent, circled the fields, their navigation lights glinting through gaps in the clouds. The sound wasn't constant but rhythmic, like patrols on a schedule. To some it felt like military activity. To others, something else entirely. On Heoley Park, a narrow road winding past hedgerows and sheep pastures, local residents stood outside after midnight, staring upward. "It's like they're searching for something," one man muttered, his breath visible in the cold. His wife nodded toward the horizon. "That's the third night now. They're flying too low for commercial planes." The aircraft made lazy, deliberate loops, their engines never fading fully. In the morning, children walking to school spoke of army planes and lights that didn't blink like normal. By the 25th, reports from neighboring villages, Craigjau, Llantrysant and Grosfein, described similar scenes. Small grey twin-prop planes flying in figure-8 formations, helicopters moving westward, with searchlights that occasionally swept the ground. One farmer, tending his lambing shed before dawn, watched as a formation passed overhead, slow and heavy, the rotors thumping against the valley walls. "If that's training," he said later, "it's training for something serious." At Cardiff Airport, civilian flight records showed temporary airspace restrictions. A notice to airmen had been issued for low-altitude military exercises in the area. Officially, it was called Exercise Chameleon, a routine special forces operation involving night jumps and aerial coordination. For those living beneath the flight paths, it didn't feel routine. Kaz Clark, a Pentrych resident, would later describe those days as eerily orchestrated. She kept a small notebook by her window, jotting down times each night when aircraft appeared. "You could almost set your watch by it," she said. They'd circle, vanish, then return half an hour later. It wasn't random. Her notes from the evening of the 25th record low-hovering helicopters and flashes of green light near the ridge of Smilog Woods, the same ridge that would become the focal point of the incident that followed. By midnight on the 26th, most of the village had gone to bed. The wind had dropped, leaving the night still. Clark and her neighbor stood outside, drawn again by the faint buzz in the distance. "I remember thinking, it's too quiet between the passes," she recalled, like the sky was waiting for something. At 1:55 a.m. the hum returned, stronger this time, joined by a deep, pulsing throb. Witnesses across Pentrych would later describe seeing a faint red glow above the fields west of the village. At first it seemed like a flare, then began to pulse rhythmically, From Clark's garden, the glow appeared fixed, hanging just above the tree line. She later told investigators it wasn't moving and it was there, like it had decided to be seen. Other villagers stepped out from their doors. It looked like a planet, one said, but it was too low and it pulsed like a heartbeat. Another recalled a curious silence between the pulses, the countryside momentarily stripped of its usual sounds. A farmer's dog began barking uncontrollably, staring into the dark. At 2:10 a.m., several residents described hearing what sounded like the slow rotation of heavy blades, helicopters approaching. Then, as one witness put it, the whole valley lit up. Dozens of lights, white, blue, and green, streaked across the sky from the direction of RAF St. Athan. They came in waves, Clark remembered. 3, then 5, then more, each in perfect formation. For a few moments, the red light remained stationary, then dimmed to a deep ember. Observers later recalled an impression of precision, not chaos. It felt military, said one. Like a cordon, others disagreed. They weren't chasing anything I could see, another resident reported. They were surrounding it. Around 2:30 a.m., the light flickered twice, then reappeared higher in the sky, now joined by 2 smaller points. To those watching, the 3 lights formed a clear triangle, sharp, symmetrical, and impossibly still. Clark whispered to her neighbor, "Do you see it?" He nodded, speechless. A faint hum filled the air, not mechanical, but vibrational, like pressure in the ears before a storm. One witness on the northern edge of the village recalled hearing a voice from the darkness. "You need to get inside now." A soldier's warning, he thought, though no insignia or vehicles were visible. Then came the roar, a single concussive thump that shook windows and sent flocks of birds scattering from the trees. It wasn't thunder, Clark said. It was something hitting the ground or leaving it. When dawn came, Pentyrch looked unchanged, but the rumors began immediately. Some said a craft had been downed in the nearby woods. Others believed it was a training mishap. The military convoy spotted later that morning near Smilog Woods lent weight to both theories. A column of green Land Rovers, their drivers silent, moved west toward the fields. Locals visiting the area that day found patches of flattened grass, as though something large had pressed into the soil. One farmer noticed a ring-shaped imprint in the frost, too wide for vehicle tracks, too even for machinery. "I didn't touch it," he said. It didn't look right. By evening, the sky was clear again. The lights were gone. The aircraft had vanished. But for those who had watched from their gardens, the sense of intrusion lingered, a quiet certainty that something extraordinary had unfolded above their fields. No press release came from the Ministry of Defense that week, beyond the repetition of Exercise Chameleon. Yet in the narrow lanes of Pentrych, the story spread like smoke. People spoke in hushed tones at the post office, in pubs outside the chapel. It was too precise to be a drill, one farmer said. They knew exactly where to look. That was the week when Pentyrch, an unremarkable Welsh village, became the epicenter of one of Britain's most debated, unexplained aerial encounters. The hum of aircraft had ceased, but in the silence that followed, the questions had only begun. February 26, 2016, 2 a.m. The village of Pentrych lay draped in darkness. A low mist clung to the hills, and the faint silhouettes of hedgerows blurred into the horizon. Inside most homes, the night passed in silence, except for the distant thrum of engines that had now become an unwelcome companion for the villagers. But tonight, the sound was different, heavier, closer. It didn't come and go in patterns anymore. It stayed, pulsing like a heartbeat above the fields. Kaz Clark, unable to sleep, stepped out into her garden. The air was cold enough to sting the skin. She had been tracking the nightly aircraft movements for nearly a week, jotting times and bearings in her notebook. But now something else caught her eye. A faint red glow low over the tree line to the west, hovering unnaturally still. "At first I thought it was a flare," she later recalled. Then it didn't fade. Across the village, other residents were seeing it too. A farmer tending to his sheep looked up and froze. "It was too bright, too steady," he told reporters later. "No movement, just hanging there." A mother on Heol Goch nudged her husband awake, urging him to look out the window. The red light pulsed slowly as if breathing. Minutes passed. Then came a mechanical rhythm, the unmistakable chop of rotor blades approaching from the east. Clark looked up again, her pulse quickening. "They're coming for it," she whispered. From behind the hills, a formation of helicopters and military aircraft appeared, sweeping low, their lights blinking in strict synchronization. The sky erupted into motion. Witnesses described what happened next as coordinated chaos. Multiple aircraft, Chinooks, Pumas and perhaps jets at higher altitude, maneuvered above the valley in tight, looping orbits. Their searchlights sliced through the mist, illuminating sections of the field below where the red light hovered. Some residents counted as many as 20 aircraft in the area. Others estimated fewer but confirmed that at least 2 distinct types were involved, rotary and fixed wing. "The sound was overwhelming," said a witness from nearby Groesfane. "You could feel it in your chest, not just hear it. I thought they were chasing something." The red light began to move, and not fast but deliberate. It ascended slightly, tilted, and then seemed to split into 3 distinct points of light, forming a triangular outline against the cloud cover. Clark stood frozen. "It wasn't flying in," she said. "It was becoming visible, like it phased into our air." From other vantage points across the region, drivers on the A4199 reported seeing a similar formation. 3 bright lights in a perfect triangle, stationary in the sky above Pentyrch. Some pulled over, thinking it was a military exercise. "It looked structured," said one motorist. "You could tell there was mass behind it, not just lights." At approximately 2:20 a.m., a smaller greenish-white orb detached from the triangle and darted toward the northwest at impossible speed. Several witnesses gasped, expecting an explosion or sonic boom, but the air stayed eerily quiet for a few seconds. Then the helicopters surged after it, searchlights sweeping the woods below. Clark described hearing a massive, concussive bang seconds later, a sound that rolled across the valley like thunder. The ground shook. My neighbor came out shouting, asking what was happening. The dogs were going mad. It felt like something had exploded or crashed. From Llantrisant, several miles away, residents reported flashes in the sky followed by a low rumble. One man, an ex-serviceman, later told a local reporter, "That wasn't training ordnance. That was something big." In Pentrych itself, power flickered momentarily. Lights dimmed in several houses. Clark would later claim she felt a static charge in the air, her hair standing on end. "There was this vibration," she said. "You could feel it in your bones. When the rumble subsided, the red light was gone. Only the helicopters remained, circling the area in widening arcs. Some hovered motionless, others swept their searchlights over fields near Smilog Woods. They were looking for something," said one farmer who watched from his barn window. "You could tell that they weren't rehearsing. They were reacting." Around 3 a.m., a convoy of ground vehicles, dark trucks with no visible markings, was seen entering the area from the east. A local resident driving home from Cardiff recalled being stopped by a police vehicle on the outskirts of the village. "They told me the road ahead was closed for a training exercise," and he said, but the officer looked uneasy, like he didn't believe it himself. By 4 a.m., the sky had begun to clear. The helicopters dispersed one by one, fading into the distance. The valley fell silent again, save for the barking of dogs and the whisper of wind through the hedges. The villagers were left staring at the empty horizon, uncertain of what they had just witnessed. When dawn finally came, the landscape bore traces of disturbance. A section of field appeared flattened, grass scorched in irregular patterns. Trees at the edge of Smilog Woods showed signs of breakage halfway up their trunks, as though something immense had passed through with downward force. The smell of ozone lingered in the morning air. Later that morning, small teams of uniformed personnel were spotted near the fields. They carried equipment cases and worked quietly, avoiding eye contact with onlookers. "I asked one of them what happened," Clark recalled. "He just said, 'You shouldn't be here, love. Best go home.'" News spread quickly across social media. Posts on local forums described a UFO chased by the military, huge bangs over Pentrych, and lights like nothing I've ever seen. The Ministry of Defence's official statement came 2 days later. The activity observed was part of a pre-planned military exercise known as Exercise Chameleon. But for those who were there, the explanation didn't fit. The precision of the lights, the explosion, the unmarked ground vehicles, it didn't feel like training. Clark and several others insisted that something non-conventional had entered the airspace that night. "It was like watching two worlds intersect," she said. "Ours and something else entirely." Even years later, the villagers recall that night in fragments, the hum, the glow, the trembling earth. The official reports call it an exercise. The witnesses call it a chase. Whatever the truth, the events of 2 a.m. on that cold Welsh night marked the beginning of what would become one of Britain's most contested modern mysteries, the Unexplained Pentyrch Incident. 2:35 a.m., February 26, 2016. The sky above Pentrych had become a theatre of confusion, a clash of silence and sound. The triangle of lights, once hovering motionless over the western ridge, began to shift. It wasn't erratic or random, but measured, deliberate, like a vessel repositioning itself. Kaz Clark, standing at the edge of her garden, watched in disbelief as the red light at the apex of the triangle pulsed brighter, while two smaller white lights along its base shimmered faintly in response. She called to her neighbor across the fence, her voice trembling. "It's moving. Look, it's moving toward the helicopters." Above the valley, the rumble of engines intensified. A formation of military aircraft, perhaps 4 helicopters and 2 jets at higher altitude, closed in fast from the east. Their lights swept through the haze, converging on the luminous triangle. The air pressure seemed to thicken. "It felt like the sky itself was vibrating," Clark would later say. "You could almost feel the tension between them." Then came the moment that would divide believers and skeptics alike. From beneath the triangle, a smaller greenish-white orb detached, smooth, spherical, and bright. It shot downward briefly, then veered sharply northwest in a blur of motion that no conventional aircraft could match. Every witness described the same detail. There was no arc, no gradual acceleration, just a blur, a flash, and then emptiness. "The helicopters turned instantly," said a farmer watching from his field. "They swung after it like hounds after a fox." Others saw what looked like tracer flares fired from one of the aircraft, glowing briefly before vanishing into the mist. A few seconds later, the valley echoed with a deep, concussive boom, a single percussive thud that rolled through the ground like distant artillery fire. Windows rattled. Birds erupted from the trees in panicked flocks. One resident thought a gas main had exploded. Another swore he saw a streak of light descend into the forest. Kaz Clark ducked instinctively, covering her ears. "It wasn't thunder," she said. "It was physical. You could feel it in your chest." Then everything went quiet. For a few seconds, the night fell into eerie stillness. No engines, no rotors, just the faint hum of the wind. And then, almost as suddenly, the helicopters returned, this time sweeping their searchlights over the fields and woodlands north of the village. Their beams cut through the low fog, converging on an area near Smilog Woods. They were searching, Clark recalled. No doubt about it, they were looking for something that had come down. In the distance, a second explosion, smaller, sharper, reverberated faintly, followed by a streak of white light, climbing briefly before vanishing. Some witnesses thought it was flares, others a signal. Whatever it was, the airspace above Pentrych became a web of light and motion. For the villagers, it was chaos. For the military, it seemed methodical. A resident named Mike Henbury, who was watching from a nearby hill, later told a local paper, "You could tell they weren't rehearsing. They were responding. The way those aircraft moved, that was pursuit, not practice." His words were echoed by others across the region who saw the same spectacle, a red triangular light, a smaller object escaping northward, and the unmistakable roar of jets at full throttle chasing it into the night. The next sound was unlike anything the witnesses had heard before, a low, oscillating hum that seemed to ripple through the air. Clark described it as a vibration more than a noise, like the atmosphere itself was under strain. Her neighbor claimed to see the triangular formation shimmer and distort, as though cloaked in heat haze. Then, just as abruptly as it had appeared, the shape began to fade, its lights dimming one by one until only the faint red point remained, hovering, motionless before it too winked out. In the aftermath of the explosion, several houses on the northern side of the village experienced brief power fluctuations. Lights flickered, and one resident reported her car alarm triggering spontaneously. "It was like the electricity in the air spiked," she said. "You could smell metal like after lightning." At around 3 a.m., a series of low rumbles returned, the unmistakable sound of heavy vehicles. Residents who dared to look outside described convoys of unmarked military trucks moving slowly along the rural lanes toward the woods. Their headlights were dimmed, their drivers anonymous behind darkened glass. When one villager attempted to approach, a soldier reportedly shouted from the roadside, "Turn back, restricted area." The warning was firm but not aggressive, as if rehearsed. Those who ignored it noticed figures in night vision gear combing the fields, their infrared scopes glowing faintly. They weren't looking for debris, Clark insisted. They were retrieving something. Nearby in the hedgerows, a faint chemical smell drifted, sharp and sterile like ozone and fuel. By 3:30 a.m., the military presence intensified. Helicopters hovered stationary over Smilog Woods, searchlights fixed on a single point within the tree line. One local taxi driver, returning from Cardiff, recalled seeing a faint column of smoke rising from the area. It wasn't fire, he said, but something was smoldering. You could see the glow under the trees. Within the hour, the operation appeared to wind down. The helicopters ascended, circling twice before disappearing to the southeast. The ground vehicles began to retreat, their lights vanishing one by one into the mist. By 4 a.m., Pentyrch was silent again, but the silence was different now, heavy with aftershock. At dawn, Clark and her neighbor walked toward the fields. The air was crisp, the grass damp with dew. Near the edge of the woods, they found patches of scorched ground, a faint ring of flattened vegetation, and several trees sheared midway up their trunks. The marks looked surgical, not random. Something landed there, she said quietly, or tried to. The official explanation would come days later, a statement from the Ministry of Defense repeating the same line. The activity observed on the night of February 26th formed part of a routine military training exercise. Yet no training schedule from RAF Saint-Athan or the MOD publicly accounted for the detonations or electromagnetic anomalies later recorded at the site. For the residents, the memory of that night remained vivid. The pursuit, the explosion, the green object that vanished like a spark into the horizon. Some believed a craft had been intercepted. Others thought it was a controlled demonstration gone wrong. But for Clark, there was no doubt. They caught something, she said years later. And whatever it wasn't ours. That early morning in Pentrych left behind no wreckage the public could see, no photographs that could settle the matter. Only stories, detailed, consistent, and unresolved. Stories of lights that didn't behave like aircraft, of explosions that shook the hills, and of soldiers who arrived before anyone could ask why. In the cold Welsh dawn, the villagers were left staring at empty skies, wondering what had really passed through them that night. Dawn arrived quietly over Pentyrch on the morning of February 26, 2016, the kind of cold, colorless dawn that blurs the line between night and morning. The fields were slick with dew, and mist clung to the hedgerows like smoke that refused to lift. For most villagers, sleep had been broken by the events of the night, the pulsing lights, the thunderous sound that seemed to roll beneath the earth, and the unmistakable sense that something beyond ordinary comprehension had unfolded in those open fields. By first light, the village began to stir. A few locals ventured out, following the direction of the lights they had seen just hours before. Near the edge of Garth Hill, where farmland opened toward the tree line, they found the ground scarred and blackened. Patches of grass had been seared away entirely, leaving a jagged circle of scorched earth, roughly the size of a small house. Branches from the surrounding trees were torn and splintered, some lying twisted as if crushed by intense pressure. The smell in the air was unfamiliar, metallic and acrid, like a combination of ozone and burning wire. Kaz Clark, one of the primary witnesses to the night's events, later recalled stepping into that field and feeling the static hum of something residual. It was like the air still held charge, she would say. Every hair on my arm stood up. Her friend, standing beside her, said he could hear a faint ringing sound that seemed to come from nowhere. Within the hour, military presence was visible. First, a pair of unmarked Land Rovers appeared along Heolfis Park Road, driving slowly toward the area. Then came uniformed personnel, men in dark fatigues, speaking little and moving with deliberate precision. They erected makeshift barriers around sections of the field and began ordering onlookers to leave the vicinity. Routine training exercise, one of them told a farmer who questioned the sudden lockdown. Please return to your property. The tone was polite but absolute. Helicopters followed soon after, first a green Royal Air Force Puma, then another with no visible markings, its blades chopping the air in rhythmic bursts. It hovered low over the woods for several minutes, then banked sharply away toward Cardiff. The villagers stood in silence, watching as dust and leaves spiraled upward under the downdraft. Whatever explanation the military offered, it did not sit easily with those who had seen the triangle of lights only hours before. By mid-morning, an official notice was issued. Exercise Chameleon, a pre-planned multi-agency training event, had taken place overnight in the Pentrych area. According to the statement, the exercise involved simulated aerial maneuvers, ground coordination, and emergency response practice. There was no mention of explosions, no mention of the glowing red object, and certainly no admission that anything had gone wrong. Yet the evidence on the ground told a more complicated story. Residents living along Garth Hill Road reported hearing what sounded like a crash in the early hours, a single heavy impact followed by a second, smaller detonation. Others spoke of flashes illuminating the fields brighter than lightning, but without thunder following. Some who attempted to photograph the sky found their phone batteries inexplicably drained within seconds. "You could feel it," one man said, "like something electromagnetic pulsing through you." Later that day, a local forestry worker attempting to access part of the woodland was stopped by armed personnel. "This area is restricted," they said. When he asked why, he was told that debris from the exercise might pose a safety hazard. The man was asked to leave immediately. When he returned the next day, the soldiers were gone, and so was a significant portion of the ground vegetation, as if burned away by high heat. Official channels remained silent. The Ministry of Defense responded to initial media queries with the same refrain: routine exercise, no cause for concern. When journalists from local papers tried to access the fields, they found newly posted private property signs and were warned by police that they could be prosecuted for trespass. The fields that had glowed red the night before were now eerily quiet, yet marked with the unmistakable signature of violence. In the weeks that followed, curiosity turned to quiet unease. Residents shared photographs of scorched patches on social media, though many were quickly deleted after warnings about sensitive material. A few amateur researchers collected soil samples, later claiming that the magnetic properties appeared abnormal. There were also reports of livestock refusing to enter certain fenced areas, and of birds avoiding the treetops altogether. Those who had been closest to the lights began to describe unusual after effects, headaches, sleep disruption, brief memory gaps. Nothing conclusive, but persistent enough to raise questions. One witness wrote in her diary, "They say it was a drill, but drills don't make the ground burn." As months passed, the Pentrych community grew divided. Some accepted the official explanation, reluctant to dwell on something they could neither prove nor explain. Others grew more convinced that a collision of some kind, terrestrial or otherwise, had occurred under military supervision. A few former servicemen, familiar with RAF operations, pointed out that Exercise Chameleon had never been publicly announced before that night. Highly unusual for a scheduled event involving multiple aircraft. For Kaz Clark, the turning point came when her attempts to retrieve official flight logs were denied under Section 26 of the Freedom of Information Act, the clause concerning national security. "If it was just training," she told an interviewer later, "why classify it like a threat to the state?" The more the military denied, the stronger the conviction among locals became. Even years later, the scars in that field remained faintly visible from above, the ghostly trace of something that had fallen or landed or been destroyed in the darkness of that February night. And in every conversation, the same question lingered. If nothing happened, why did they come at dawn to erase it? In Pentych, the morning after the incident marked not just the end of a strange night, but the beginning of a silence that still hasn't lifted. Weeks passed after that February night, but in Pentrych the sense of unease never did. The fields where the red light had hovered were quiet again, but something about them felt wrong, as though the air itself carried memory. Locals avoided the area at dusk. The sheep would not graze near the burned patch, and birds never settled on the scorched hedgerows. Even the farmers said the ground felt dead, unable to regrow properly despite the early spring rains. By mid-March, rumors began to spread beyond the village. Online forums dedicated to aviation and UFO research started picking up the story. The Pentyrch Incident, they called it. Photographs of the blackened field appeared on social media, accompanied by eyewitness accounts, describing the triangular formation of lights and the sound of low-flying aircraft. Some dismissed it as exaggeration. Others, particularly former military personnel, were less certain. "That doesn't sound like a drill," wrote one ex-RAF technician. "If it were, the ministry would have logged NOTAMs, notices to airmen." There were none. As curiosity grew, a small group of researchers arrived in Pentrych. Among them was a retired engineer named Gary Jones, who brought electromagnetic sensors and radiation meters. What he found unsettled him. "The readings were high," he said later in an interview. "Not dangerous, but elevated, several times higher than background levels." Jones double-checked his instruments, recalibrated them, and took samples from control sites 2 miles away. The difference persisted. Something, he concluded, had ionized that area. That same week, Clark and other witnesses began submitting Freedom of Information requests to the Ministry of Defense. They wanted flight logs, radar data, and official documentation confirming the details of Exercise Chameleon. Weeks later, the replies came back, mostly redacted. Page after page of black ink where explanations should have been. Only one section remained readable. Information withheld under Section 26, Defense and Security Exemption. That single phrase, defense and security, became a spark. What kind of training exercise needed national security protection? And why, locals asked, were civilian recordings of that night vanishing from the internet within hours of being posted? A Cardiff journalist, Sarah Pritchard, began following the story. She visited Pentyrch twice, interviewing residents who had seen the lights. Her article for Wales Online was careful, factual, not sensational. It recounted the witnesses' testimonies and the official statement from the Ministry of Defense. Yet within days of publication, the piece was quietly archived. Editorial decision, she was told. Too speculative. She later confided to a colleague that someone from the MOD's Media Liaison Office had called the paper before the article went live. Meanwhile, the witnesses continued to speak out. Clark held community meetings where villagers shared their experiences. One man described a sound like air tearing apart. Another spoke of a green light that darted between the trees, faster than anything man-made. The details varied, but the tone was consistent, all mixed with quiet fear. In early April, a former air traffic controller from St. Athan, speaking anonymously, confirmed that multiple radar returns were logged over Pentyrch that night, though they appeared and disappeared too quickly to identify. "It looked like clutter at first," he said, "but the pattern was too precise. We saw it, and then it was gone." As researchers pressed further, inconsistencies began to appear in the official narrative. Exercise Chameleon, they learned, had no prior record, no public notice, no pre-event coordination with local emergency services, which was standard protocol for large-scale night operations. Even more curious, no subsequent mention in RAF activity reports. It was effectively an exercise that existed only in name and in one carefully worded press release. Then came the environmental findings. Independent analysis of soil samples collected from the field showed unusual traces of metal particulates, titanium, nickel, and vanadium, elements commonly associated with aerospace alloys. Experts cautioned that such materials could have originated from common aircraft debris, but the sample's distribution pattern didn't match that explanation. The particles were fine, evenly dispersed, and fused into the upper soil layer as though exposed to intense heat or electromagnetic discharge. The Ministry of Defense's position remained unchanged. Routine training. No aircraft incidents reported. No recovery operations conducted. Yet residents swore they had seen military trucks moving through the area in the early hours, headlights blacked out, and large tarps covering objects being loaded aboard. One farmer, who lived near the access road, said he heard metal scraping on metal and voices speaking urgently but quietly. To many in Pentyrch, it was the silence, not the noise, that became impossible to ignore. The official channels closed ranks. Local police referred all questions to the MOD. The MOD refused all further comment. Even members of Parliament who raised the issue received brief replies citing no evidence to support claims of an unidentified object. And yet, the locals couldn't shake the feeling that something had passed over their fields, something real, physical, and not fully explained. One woman described how weeks later, her dog would still bark at the empty hillside after dark. Others spoke of hearing faint mechanical hums in the distance, as if the sky itself was replaying the memory. By summer, investigators had gathered a timeline, a web of testimony, radar anomalies, and scientific curiosities, but no single answer. The pieces fit too well to be coincidence, yet too imperfectly to form proof. When pressed for closure, Clark said only this: "They can redact reports, they can seal fields, they can call it an exercise, but they can't erase what we saw." Years later, the Pentyrch case became a symbol, not of belief in extraterrestrials, but of distrust in the veil of official secrecy. The redactions, the silence, the subtle warnings, all of it felt familiar to those who had lived through other government cover-ups. It wasn't proof of aliens that haunted Pentyrch. It was proof that someone somewhere knew more than they were willing to say. And in that quiet Welsh valley, where the grass still struggles to grow evenly, that night's light still lingers, not in the sky, but in the memories of those who watched the truth rise, burn, and vanish behind the hills. Nearly a decade has passed since that cold February night. Yet in Pentyrch, the air still carries the weight of something unresolved. The fields have long been ploughed and reseeded, the scorch marks faded beneath layers of new grass. But the questions and the quiet sense of intrusion never left. The Pentrych incident has become, over time, less a story about what happened and more about what wasn't allowed to be known. In Britain's long history of unexplained aerial encounters, few events have stirred such quiet persistence. There were older mysteries: the Rendlesham Forest affair of 1980, the Broadhaven sightings of the late 1970s. But Pentrych was different. It happened in an age of smartphones, flight tracking software, and digital verification. Yet even with all the tools of modern observation, the truth remained elusive. Witnesses had phones that failed to record, cameras froze, radar data vanished, and when the Freedom of Information requests began, they were met not with answers, but with silence behind blacked-out pages. That silence became the heart of the story. For those who lived it, like Kaz Clark and the handful of residents who saw the triangular formation hanging motionless in the night sky, memory took on a strange clarity. They could recall not just the shape of the lights, but their rhythm. The way the red core pulsed, the triangular tips glowing in perfect unison, then dispersing as if reacting to something unseen. Clark once described it as an intelligence at work, deliberate, aware, and powerful. Others remembered different fragments: the metallic hum, the sensation of pressure in the air, the sharp ozone scent that followed the explosion. Some said they saw small lights scatter upward after the detonation, like sparks from a fire being pulled into the clouds. It wasn't hysteria. Their testimonies were calm, consistent, and measured. And yet, the more they spoke, the more official resistance grew. By 2018, the Pentrych incident had become a magnet for journalists, researchers, and skeptics alike. Documentaries were produced, debates were held on local radio, and Clark herself gave several interviews insisting that what had been seen was no aircraft known to human technology. She described how the military, she believed, had engaged it, how helicopters, jets, and ground teams had coordinated to contain whatever had appeared in those fields. It wasn't an exercise, she said firmly. It was an event they didn't expect. Her words drew both support and derision. The skeptics pointed out inconsistencies, suggesting atmospheric plasma, misidentified flares, or even drone activity. But none could fully explain the synchronized triangular formation, nor the electromagnetic interference reported by multiple households that night. For every theory proposed, another anomaly surfaced, and so Pentyrch became what it remains today, a fracture line between two truths: what people saw and what the state admitted. In the years that followed, Clark continued to collect evidence: interviews, photographs, maps, soil readings, even hand-drawn diagrams of the light formations. She turned her findings into presentations for the public, careful to separate speculation from fact. "I'm not saying what it was," she would remind her audiences, "only what it wasn't." The military, for its part, maintained a posture of polite indifference. When pressed by reporters, the Ministry of Defense repeated the same statement. The MOD no longer investigates reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. A policy change, they said, had rendered such matters outside the scope of defense interest. Yet, as researchers discovered, multiple RAF training schedules in late February 2016 had been classified for reasons not disclosed. Over time, the story spread beyond Wales. American researchers began to include Pentrych in global databases of close encounters. The incident was compared to the 1997 Phoenix Lights. Similar triangular geometry, similar silence from authorities. A BBC Radio Wales programme revisited the case in 2020, treating it with cautious seriousness. "There's no consensus," the host concluded. "Only accounts that refuse to fade." Even among those who doubted extraterrestrial origins, a pattern was hard to ignore. The presence of multiple aircraft without civilian flight records, the localized electromagnetic disturbances, the official denials that grew firmer as public interest rose. "It's as though the truth was classified before anyone could define it," one analyst remarked. For Pentrych itself, the legacy became twofold. To some, it was a point of quiet pride, a mystery that had placed their small Welsh village on the map of global intrigue. To others, it was an unwelcome shadow, a conversation that reopened old unease. Farmers who once dismissed the event later admitted that their livestock had behaved oddly for months after, avoiding the northern pastures. A local electrician recalled how in the weeks following the explosion, power surges destroyed several appliances on Heol Y Park Road. "We replaced circuit boards every other day," he said. It was like the grid itself was remembering. As of today, no official record has been released that contradicts the MOD's statement. The Welsh government has referred all queries back to national authorities, and yet the case continues to appear in academic papers, podcasts, and investigative series. The more time passes, the more the Pentyrch incident resembles a mirror, reflecting not only a night of strange lights, but the reflex of institutions when confronted with uncertainty. "The thing about Pentyrch," wrote historian and aviation researcher Michael Swords, "isn't what was seen. It's what wasn't allowed to be examined. That's the measure of its significance, not the event but the wall built around it. For those who still live there, that wall is both invisible and constant. The lights have not returned, but the memory lingers in the rhythm of the night, in the way villagers still glance toward the Garth hillside when the wind shifts, half expecting to see the glow again." In the end, perhaps the true legacy of Pentrych is not the mystery of what came down, but the quiet endurance of those who remember. It remains a story about control, silence, and the fine edge between explanation and erasure. And somewhere above those rolling Welsh fields, beneath the same quiet stars, the sky holds its secret. Still, after all these years, refusing to give it back. In the end, the story of Pentrych is not only about lights in the sky, it's about what happens when truth meets silence. It's about the night a quiet Welsh village became the stage for something extraordinary, only to be buried beneath layers of protocol, secrecy, and denial. The burned grass grew back. The soldiers left. The reports were sealed. But the memory and the questions never faded. Maybe the real mystery isn't what appeared over Pentrych, but why, after all these years, no one in authority dares to name it. Because sometimes the silence is the confession.